The mountain cabin groaned under the weight of the blizzard, its wooden walls shuddering as wind howled through the peaks like the voices of the damned. Inside, Laura Collins pressed herself against the far wall, her scarred hands trembling as she watched the door strain against its hinges. The storm had been raging for 3 days now, and she knew that when it finally broke, they would come for her. Her fingers traced the raised lines that crisscrossed her arms, each mark a memory she wished she could forget. The fire in the hearth cast dancing shadows across her face, illuminating the network of scars that ran from her temple down to her jaw, a roadmap of survival written in pain. She had warned him about them when he first found her, broken and bleeding in the snow 6 months ago. "I have scars everywhere," she had whispered, expecting him, expecting him to turn away like all the others had. But Joshua Ortiz had simply nodded, his weathered hands gentle as he tended her wounds. "Good," he had said in his quiet, measured way. "They prove you're a survivor." Those words had changed something fundamental in her, though she was only beginning to understand what. Now, as she listened to the storm that would determine both their fates, Laura wondered if surviving was enough anymore. The men hunting her had found her trail, and this time there would be no escape into the wilderness. This time she would have to face what she had been running from for so long. The door shuddered again, and she heard Joshua's boots on the porch, heavy with snow and purpose. When he entered, his dark eyes found hers immediately, reading the fear she tried so hard to hide. Ice crystals clung to his black beard, and his shoulders bore the weight of more than just the storm. "They're coming," he said simply, setting down his rifle by the door. "Maybe 2 hours, maybe less when this breaks." Laura nodded, having expected this moment for weeks now. The peaceful months in his cabin had been borrowed time, a respite she had never deserved. She stood slowly, her body still bearing the ache of old injuries that would never fully heal. "You don't have to stay," she said, though the words felt like glass in her throat. "This isn't your fight." Joshua was already moving toward the window, checking the heavy shutters he had reinforced just for this day. "It became my fight the moment I decided you were worth saving." The weight of his words settled over her like a blanket, warm and terrifying in equal measure. Laura had spent so long believing she was beyond saving, beyond worth, that hearing it spoken so simply by this mountain man who asked for nothing in return felt like a miracle she didn't know how to accept. But to understand how they had arrived at this moment, with death approaching through the storm and two unlikely souls preparing to face it together, the story must return to where it truly began. The saloon reeked of whiskey and unwashed bodies, a familiar cocktail of desperation that Laura had grown accustomed to in the weeks since her world had crumbled. She kept her head down as she moved between tables, collecting empty glasses and dodging the grabbing hands of men who saw her scars as evidence of availability rather than survival. The burns on her left arm, still pink and angry from the fire that had taken everything, drew stares and whispers wherever she went. "Hey, Scarface," called out a voice from the corner table. "Bring us another bottle." The laughter that followed was cruel and familiar, the same sound that had driven her from 3 other establishments in as many weeks. Laura retrieved the whiskey bottle from behind the bar, her movements careful and deliberate. She had learned that sudden gestures drew attention, and attention led to questions she couldn't answer. The man who had called out was Nicholas Hughes, a cattle baron's son with soft hands and hard eyes. He made a show of looking her up and down as she approached, his gaze lingering on the scars that ran along her neck and disappeared beneath her collar. "What happened to you, darling?" he asked, his voice loud enough to carry across the room. "Run into a wildcat?" The bottle trembled slightly in Laura's grip, but she said nothing. Speaking back had only made things worse in the past. She set the whiskey on the table and turned to leave, but Hughes caught her wrist, his fingers pressing into the tender scar tissue there. "I asked you a question," he said, his grip tightening. "It's rude not to answer when a gentleman speaks to you." "Please," Laura whispered, trying to pull away. "I just want to work." "Let her go, Hughes." The voice came from the bar, quiet but carrying the kind of authority that made the entire saloon fall silent. Laura looked up to see a man she didn't recognize, tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of years in the wilderness. His dark hair was longer than fashion dictated, and his clothes were practical rather than stylish. Hughes released Laura's wrist but didn't back down. "This doesn't concern you, stranger." "Didn't look much like conversation from where I'm standing," the man replied, his hand resting casually on the gun at his hip. "Looked more like a coward picking on someone who can't fight back." The insult hung in the air like smoke, and Laura saw Hughes's face flush red with anger. But instead of reaching for his own weapon, Hughes seemed to reconsider as he took in the stranger's calm confidence. "You want the scarred horse so bad you can have her," Hughes said finally, throwing money on the table. He and his companions left the saloon with loud boasts about finding better entertainment elsewhere, leaving Laura alone with the stranger who had intervened on her behalf. She expected him to approach her then, to claim whatever reward he thought his gallantry had earned him. Instead, he simply nodded in her direction and returned to his drink. When closing time came, she found herself reluctant to leave the protection of his proximity. "Thank you," she said as she passed his table, the words barely audible. He looked up at her then, his dark eyes taking in her face with an expression she couldn't read. "What's your name?" "Laura," she replied, surprised by the question. "I'm Joshua," he said, "Joshua Ortiz. You shouldn't be working in a place like this." The observation was gentle but firm, and Laura felt tears prick at her eyes. "It's the only place that would hire me." Joshua studied her for a long moment. "There are better places," he said. "Safer places. Not for someone who looks like me." "Your scars don't define your worth," Joshua said quietly. "They just prove you've survived something that would have killed a weaker person." The words hit Laura like a physical blow, so unexpected and kind that she didn't know how to respond. "I should go," she managed, backing toward the door. "Laura," his voice stopped her at the threshold. "If you ever need help, I'll be in the mountains. Follow the north trail out of town for about 10 miles. There's a cabin near the creek." The next 3 weeks passed in a haze of familiar misery. Laura lost her job at the saloon when Hughes complained to the owner about her presence driving away customers. She found temporary work washing dishes at a boarding house, but that ended when the proprietor's wife decided her scars were disturbing the other residents. She was sleeping in an alley behind the general store when the fire started. Laura woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of shouting. The boarding house across the street was engulfed in flames, the wooden structure going up like kindling in the dry mountain air. People were running in all directions, some carrying belongings, others just trying to escape the spreading conflagration. Without thinking, Laura ran toward the building. She could hear screaming from the second floor, a child's voice calling for help. The front entrance was blocked by flames, but she remembered a back staircase that might still be passable. The heat was overwhelming as she climbed the stairs, her lungs burning with each breath. Smoke filled the hallway, making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. She followed the sound of crying to a room at the far end, where she found a little girl huddled under a bed, too frightened to move. "Come on, sweetheart," Laura said, reaching for the child. "We have to go now." The girl looked up at her with wide, terrified eyes, and Laura saw the exact moment when her scars registered. The child's face crumpled with fresh fear, and she shrank away from Laura's outstretched hand. "You're scary," the girl whimpered. "I want my mama." The words cut deep, but Laura pushed the pain aside. "I know I look scary," she said gently, "but I'm going to get you out of here, okay? Your mama is waiting for you outside." Slowly, carefully, she coaxed the girl out from under the bed and lifted her into her arms. The building groaned around them as the fire ate through its supports, and Laura knew they had minutes at most before the whole structure collapsed. The back staircase was partially blocked by fallen debris, forcing Laura to climb over burning timber with the child clutched against her chest. Each step was agony as flames licked at Laura's already scarred skin, adding fresh burns to the collection she carried. They made it to the ground floor just as the ceiling began to cave in. Laura stumbled out the back door and into the arms of the volunteer firefighters, who took the child from her and rushed them both to safety. The little girl was reunited with her frantic mother, while Laura was left to tend her new injuries alone. She was sitting on a crate behind the doctor's office, wrapping her burned hands in torn strips of her skirt, when Joshua found her. I heard what you did, he said, settling beside her on another crate. That was brave, Laura laughed bitterly. Brave? The child was terrified of me. Children are afraid of what they don't understand, Joshua replied. But you saved her life despite that fear. That's the definition of courage. He took her hands gently, examining the fresh burns with practiced eyes. These need proper treatment. Come with me. I can't pay a doctor. I didn't say anything about a doctor. Joshua stood and offered her his hand. I said, come with me. Laura looked up at him, this mountain man who had appeared in her life like an answer to prayers she had been afraid to voice. Why, she asked. Why would you help me? Joshua was quiet for a moment, his eyes distant. Because someone helped me once, when I needed it most. Because you deserve better than what this place has given you, and because I can see who you really are underneath all that pain. And who am I? A survivor, he said simply, someone worth saving. Laura took his hand and led him hail me to her feet. As they walked away from the burning building and the life she was leaving behind, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. The journey to Joshua's cabin took most of the day, following winding mountain trails that seemed to climb endlessly into the sky. The cabin, when they finally reached it, was larger than she had expected. Built from logs and stone, it nestled into the mountainside as if it had grown there naturally. It's beautiful, she said as Joshua helped her down from the horse. It's home, he replied, and something in his voice suggested that was a precious thing to him. Inside, the cabin was warm and clean, furnished with handmade furniture that spoke of skill and patience. Joshua led her to a chair by the fire and returned with a wooden box filled with medical supplies. Let me see your hands, he said, kneeling in front of her. Laura hesitated, then slowly unwrapped the makeshift bandages. The burns were worse than she had thought, the skin blistered and raw. Joshua examined them with gentle fingers, his touch careful and professional. You've done this before, she observed. Had to learn, he said, cleaning the wounds with practiced efficiency. Living up here, you can't always get to a doctor when you need one. As he worked, Laura found herself studying his face, noting the small scars that marked his own skin. The lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into mountain sun and wind. How long have you lived here? She asked. 5 years, Joshua replied, securing the last bandage. Came up here after I needed to get away from people for a while. There was pain in his voice, old and carefully controlled. Laura recognized it because she carried the same kind of wound. What happened to you? She asked softly. Joshua was quiet for so long that she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I had a family once, a wife, 2 children. There was a fever that came through our town, took most of the young ones. I was away on business, couldn't get back in time to... He stopped, his hand stilling on the medical supplies. When I came home, they were already buried. Laura felt tears prick at her eyes, recognizing the particular kind of grief that came from losing everything at once. I'm sorry, she whispered. People can be cruel when they're afraid, Joshua continued. They need someone to blame, and a stranger is an easy target. I realized I couldn't stay there anymore. He finished packing away the medical supplies and sat back on his heels, looking at her with those dark, understanding eyes. What about you? He asked gently. What brought you to Denver looking like you'd been through hell? Laura had told this story before, to landlords and potential employers, always editing out the worst parts. But something about Joshua's own honesty made her want to tell the truth for once. I was married, she began, her voice barely audible, to a man named Frank Mendoza. He seemed kind at first, gentle, but after the wedding things changed. He had a temper, and when he drank... She touched the scar on her jaw unconsciously. This one was from a broken bottle. Joshua's face darkened, but he remained silent, letting her continue at her own pace. I tried to leave several times, but he always found me. He had money, influence. The law wouldn't help a woman against her husband. So I stayed, and the scars accumulated. Each one was a lesson about my place in the world, he said. She paused, remembering the weight of those years, the way hope had slowly died under the constant assault on her spirit and body. The fire was my fault, she continued. I had been planning to leave again. had hidden some money and supplies. Frank found them, and he was angrier than I'd ever seen him. He held my face over a candle flame, said he was going to mark me so that no other man would ever want me. I fought back, and the candle fell. The whole house went up. Laura looked down at her bandaged hands, remembering that night of flames and terror and desperate escape. Frank didn't make it out, she said quietly. I tried to save him, but the smoke. By the time I got back with help, it was too late. His family blamed me, said I had murdered him for his money. I had to run before they could have me arrested. The silence that followed was heavy with understanding rather than judgment. Joshua reached out slowly and covered her scarred hand with his own. You survived, he said simply. That's what matters. Sometimes I wonder if the survival is enough, Laura replied. Someone like you? Joshua's voice was gentle but firm. You mean someone brave enough to run into a burning building to save a child? Someone strong enough to escape an impossible situation and keep going when everything was against you? Laura looked up at him, seeing something in his eyes that she had almost forgotten existed. Respect. I don't feel brave, she admitted. Brave people rarely do, Joshua replied. They just do what needs to be done, even when they're terrified. The first sign of trouble came on a crisp morning in early October, when Joshua returned from his weekly trip to the trading post with news that made Laura's blood run cold. There are men asking questions in town, he said without preamble, setting down his supplies with unusual force. Men from Denver looking for a woman with scars who might have killed her husband. Laura sank into a chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. She had known this day might come, but the months of peace had lulled her into believing she might be safe. What kind of men? She asked, though she already suspected the answer. The expensive kind, Joshua replied grimly. Well-dressed, well-armed, and carrying enough money to make people remember things that might not have happened. Laura closed her eyes, seeing Frank's family in her mind's eye. The Mendozas were wealthy, influential, and they had never forgiven her for surviving when their precious son had not. How much time do we have? She asked. Hard to say. They're being methodical, checking every lead, but someone in town might remember seeing you with me. Joshua moved to the window, his hand resting on his rifle. We need to decide what we're going to do. Laura stood slowly, her mind already made up. I need to leave. Tonight, before they can trace me here. I won't let them hurt you because of me. Like hell you will. Joshua's voice was sharp with anger. You think I'm going to let you run off into the wilderness alone? This isn't your fight, Laura protested. Joshua crossed the room in 3 quick strides, taking her by the shoulders and forcing her to meet his eyes. Listen to me, he said fiercely. You are not the same broken woman I found in that saloon. You are not a victim anymore, and you are not alone. The intensity in his voice took her breath away. Joshua. I've been alone for 5 years, he continued. 5 years of existing without really living. You changed that. You brought life back to this place, back to me. I'll be damned if I'm going to let anyone take that away. Laura felt tears streaming down her face, overwhelmed by the fierce protectiveness in his voice. They'll kill you, she whispered. So am I, Joshua said quietly, and for the first time she saw the steel beneath his gentle exterior. I wasn't always a hermit, Laura. Before I came to these mountains, I was a different kind of man, the kind who knew how to handle trouble when it came looking. What were you, Ashley asked. A soldier, Joshua replied, then a lawman, then a man who lost everything and came to the mountains to do me. But I didn't die, Laura. I survived, just like you did, and now I have something worth fighting for again. The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Laura saw the truth in his eyes, the depth of feeling he had been too careful to voice before. Joshua, she breathed, her hand coming up to touch his scarred cheek. I know, he said softly. I know you're not ready to hear it. Maybe never will be after what you've been through. But it doesn't change how I feel. Laura looked into his eyes and saw her own feelings reflected there. The love she had been afraid to acknowledge even to herself. I love you too, she whispered, the words feeling strange and wonderful on her tongue. I was just too scared to say it. Joshua's smile was like sunrise after a long night, transforming his weathered face with joy. He pulled her close, holding her as if she were something precious and fragile, and Laura felt the last of her walls crumble away. "What do we do?" she asked against his chest. "We prepare," Joshua said grimly, "and when they come, we show them what happens to men who hunt survivors." Laura woke to the sound of Joshua moving quietly through the cabin, his rifle in his hands and his face grim with purpose. The storm was still raging outside, but there was something different about his alertness that told her their time of preparation was over. "They're here," he said simply when he saw she was awake. "3 of them, maybe 4. They're trying to wait out the worst of the storm in the old trapper's shelter about a mile down the trail." Laura's heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands were steady as she reached for her own weapon. The weeks of preparation had given her a confidence she never thought she would possess. "How long do we have?" she asked, pulling on her boots and coat. "An hour, maybe 2. The storm will cover our movements, but it'll cover theirs too." Joshua checked the loads in his pistol with practiced efficiency. "We have 2 choices. We can wait here and let them come to us, or we can take the fight to them while they're still vulnerable." Laura considered their options, her mind working through the tactical lessons Joshua had taught her. The cabin was defensible, but it was also a trap if they were surrounded. "We go to them," she said, surprising herself with the decisiveness in her voice. "We end this before they can get organized." Joshua looked at her with something like pride in his eyes. "Are you sure? There's no going back once we step out that door." "I'm tired of running," Laura replied, checking her rifle one final time. "I'm tired of being afraid. These men came here to kill me, but I'm not the same woman they've been hunting. I'm not victim anymore." They moved out into the storm like ghosts, their dark clothing blending with the shadows between the trees. The snow was coming down so hard that visibility was reduced to mere yards. But Joshua navigated the treacherous terrain with the confidence of someone who knew every rock and root by heart. The old trapper's shelter was little more than a lean-to built against a massive boulder, but it provided enough protection from the wind to make a fire possible. Laura could see the orange glow through the trees long before they reached the clearing, and she counted 3 distinct shadows moving around the flames. Joshua held up his hand, signaling her to stop, and they crouched behind a fallen log to observe their enemies. The men were exactly what Laura had expected. Hard-faced professionals in expensive gear, their weapons clean and ready despite the harsh conditions. "The tall one is their leader," Joshua whispered in her ear. "See how the others defer to him? Take him down first, and the others might lose their nerve." Laura nodded, sighting down her rifle at the man Joshua had indicated. He was older than the others, with gray in his beard and scars that spoke of a lifetime of violence. There was something familiar about his face, and with a chill that had nothing to do with the cold, she realized she had seen him before. "That's Daniel King," she breathed. "Frank's uncle. He's the one who swore he'd see me hang for murder." Joshua's face hardened at the name. "Then he's the one who's been orchestrating this hunt. The one who won't stop until you're dead." "Can you make the shot from here?" Joshua asked quietly. Laura adjusted her grip on the rifle, feeling the familiar weight of the weapon in her hands. A month ago, she couldn't have hit the broadside of a barn. Now, after hours of practice under Joshua's patient instruction, she felt confident in her abilities. "Yes," she said simply. "Then on my signal, you take King. I'll handle the other 2. They waited in the howling darkness, 2 figures carved from shadow and determination. Laura felt a strange calm descend over her, the same clarity she had experienced when running into the burning building to save that child. Joshua raised his hand, fingers counting down from 3. Laura took a deep breath, let it out slowly, and placed her finger on the trigger. The signal came, and the mountain exploded into violence. Laura's rifle cracked like thunder, the sound echoing off the peaks and mixing with the roar of Joshua's weapon. Daniel King spun and fell, clutching his shoulder where her bullet had found its mark. The other 2 men scattered, seeking cover behind trees and rocks as Joshua's deadly accurate fire drove them back. But even wounded, Daniel King was far from finished. Laura saw him struggling to his feet, his good arm bringing up a pistol with deadly intent. She tried to swing her rifle around, but she knew she would be too slow. The pistol bucked in King's hand, the shot echoing across the clearing. But instead of Joshua falling, it was King himself who stumbled backward, a look of surprise on his weathered face. Joshua's return shot had been faster and more accurate, catching the older man's center mass and dropping him into the snow. "One down," Joshua called, but his voice was strained with pain. Laura looked over and saw blood seeping through his coat sleeve. "You're hit." "Just a graze," Joshua replied, though his face was pale with shock. "Keep your eyes on the others." The remaining two hunters had regrouped, using the confusion to advance on their position. They fell back deeper into the forest, using the storm and their knowledge of the terrain to stay ahead of their pursuers. The cave behind the waterfall was exactly as Joshua had described it, a natural fortress carved from the living rock. The frozen waterfall provided both concealment and a barrier that would force their enemies to approach from a predictable direction. Laura helped Joshua inside, her heart breaking at the pallor of his face and the way his hands shook as he tried to reload his rifle. "How bad is it?" she asked, examining his wound in the dim light. "Bad enough," Joshua admitted. "The bullet's still in there, and I'm losing too much blood." She tore strips from her shirt, creating makeshift bandages to slow the bleeding. Joshua watched her work with a mixture of pain and admiration. "You've changed," he said softly, "from the woman I found in that saloon. You're not afraid anymore." "I'm terrified," Laura corrected, tying off the bandage with hands that barely trembled. "But I'm not helpless. You taught me that." The sound of approaching footsteps echoed off the cave walls, and Laura knew their time was up. She picked up her rifle, checking the ammunition one final time before taking position near the cave mouth. "Laura," Joshua said, his voice barely audible above the storm, "whatever happens, I want you to know that loving you has been the greatest privilege of my life." She turned to look at him, this mountain man who had saved her in every way a person could be saved. "And you made me believe I was worth saving," she replied. "We're going to get through this, Joshua. Both of us." The first hunter appeared at the cave mouth, silhouetted against the storm-darkened skin. Laura didn't hesitate, her rifle speaking with deadly authority and sending the man tumbling backward into the snow. The second hunter tried to rush the entrance while she was reloading, but Joshua's shot took him in the chest. Silence fell over the clearing, broken only by the howl of the wind. Laura waited, her finger on the trigger, searching the shadows for any sign of movement. Minutes passed like hours, but no more attackers appeared. "Is that all of them?" she asked quietly. "I think so," Joshua replied, though his voice was growing weaker. Laura maintained her vigil for another 10 minutes before finally allowing herself to relax. The immediate threat was over, but Joshua's condition was deteriorating rapidly. "Can you travel?" she asked, moving to his side. Joshua tried to stand and immediately collapsed, his face gray with pain and blood loss. "I don't think so," he admitted. "I'm not leaving you," Laura said firmly. "We'll figure something else out." She began gathering supplies, her mind working through the logistics of moving a wounded man in a blizzard. It would be dangerous, possibly suicidal, but the alternative was certain death. "You're being foolish," Joshua protested. "You could die out there." "Then we'll die together," Laura replied simply. "I've been alone before, Joshua. I won't be alone again." She fashioned a crude stretcher from pine branches and rope, testing its strength before helping Joshua onto it. The journey back to the cabin was a nightmare of ice and wind and desperate determination. Laura pulled the stretcher across the treacherous terrain, her muscles screaming with effort. By the time they reached the cabin, Laura was running on pure willpower. She managed to get Joshua inside and onto the bed they had shared for so many peaceful nights. "You did it," he whispered. "You got us home." "This is just the beginning," Laura replied, already moving to gather medical supplies. She worked through the night, cleaning and dressing his wound with skills she had learned from watching him treat her own injuries months earlier. The bullet was lodged deep in his shoulder, beyond her ability to remove safely, but she managed to slow the bleeding and fight off the immediate threat of infection. As dawn broke over the mountains, Laura finally allowed herself to hope. Joshua's breathing had steadied, his color was improving, and the fever that had threatened to take him during the night had broken. The ride to Pine Ridge took most of the day, with frequent stops to rest and check Joshua's condition. The town was larger than Laura had expected, a thriving community built around lumber and mining operations. The doctor's office was located above the general store, and Laura had to help Joshua climb the narrow stairs to reach it. Dr. Betty Foster was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and capable hands, and she took one look at Joshua's condition before ushering them into her examination room. "Gunshot wound," she said matter-of-factly. "How long ago?" "About 18 hours, Laura replied. "I did what I could, but the bullet's still in there." Dr. Foster examined the wound with professional efficiency. "You did good work," she told Laura. "Probably saved his life, but we need to get that bullet out before infection sets in." The surgery took 2 hours, with Laura assisting despite her lack of formal medical training. When it was finally over, Dr. Foster sat back with a sigh of relief. "He'll live," she announced. "Full recovery will take months, but he'll live." Laura felt tears of relief streaming down her face. The immediate crisis was over, but she knew their troubles were far from finished. "Doctor," she said quietly, "there's something else you need to know. The men who shot him were hunting me. They're dead now, killed in self-defense, but there might be legal complications." Dr. Foster studied Laura's scarred face with compassionate eyes. "What kind of men were they?" Laura told the story as simply as she could, explaining about Frank's death and the Mendoza family's quest for revenge. Dr. Foster listened without judgment. "The sheriff will need to investigate," the doctor said when Laura had finished. "But from what you've told me, it sounds like a clear case of self-defense." As if summoned by their conversation, Sheriff Cynthia Peterson appeared in the doorway. She was a tall, stern-looking woman with graying hair and intelligent eyes that missed nothing. "I heard there was some trouble up in the mountains," Sheriff Peterson said without preamble. "Bodies found near the old trapper's shelter, all of them armed and carrying bounty papers with a woman's description." Laura's heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced herself to meet the sheriff's gaze steadily. "They came to kill me," she said simply. "We defended ourselves." "So I gathered." Sheriff Peterson pulled up a chair and sat down. "Tell me about it. All of it, from the beginning." Laura told the story again, this time in greater detail. Sheriff Peterson listened without interruption, occasionally making notes in a small leather journal. "I knew Daniel King," she said finally. "He passed through here about a week ago, asking questions about a scarred woman and offering money for information. There was something about him I didn't like." "You didn't help him?" "I don't help men who hunt women," Sheriff Peterson replied firmly. Laura felt a surge of hope at the sheriff's words. "Then you believe me?" "I believe the evidence," Sheriff Peterson said, "and the evidence supports your story. King and his men were heavily armed, carrying bounty papers that offered a substantial reward for your capture, dead or alive. Most importantly, they were on your property, threatening your life." The inquest was held 3 days later, a simple proceeding that confirmed what everyone already knew. Daniel King and his associates had come to Pine Ridge with the intention of committing murder, and they had died in the commission of that crime. "It's over," Joshua said when she brought him the news. "You're free." Laura looked at the man who had saved her in every way a person could be saved. "We're free," she corrected. "Both of us." The journey back to the cabin was like coming home after a long exile. The familiar peaks rose around them like old friends, and Laura felt her spirit lift as they climbed the winding trails she had learned to love. "I never thought I'd see this place again," Joshua admitted as their cabin came into view. "When that bullet hit me, I was sure I was going to die in that cave." "You underestimated my stubbornness," Laura replied, dismounting and helping him down from his horse. The cabin felt different somehow, as if their ordeal had transformed it from a simple shelter into something more significant. This was where they had found each other, where they had learned to love and trust and hope again. "I've been thinking," Joshua said as Laura prepared their evening meal, "about what happens next, about our future." Laura looked up from the stew she was stirring, seeing something important in his expression. "What about it?" Joshua was quiet for a moment, as if gathering his courage. "I know we haven't talked about it directly, but these past months, what we've built together, it feels like more than just two people sharing a cabin." "It is more," Laura said softly, "at least for me." "For me, too." Joshua reached into his pocket and withdrew something small and worn. "This was my mother's ring. I've carried it for 20 years, never thinking I'd have reason to use it again." Laura's heart stopped as she realized what he was asking. The ring was simple but beautiful, a band of gold set with a small emerald that caught the firelight. Laura Collins, Joshua said, his voice rough with emotion. Will you marry me? Will you be my wife, my partner, my companion for whatever years we have left? Laura looked at this man who had seen past her scars to the woman beneath, who had fought beside her and nearly died protecting her. She thought of all the reasons she should say no, all the ways she was damaged and difficult. Then she thought of the woman she had become in his presence, the strength she had discovered in herself, the love that had grown between them like a flower blooming in rocky soil. Yes, she said simply. Yes, I'll marry you. Joshua's smile was like sunrise over the mountains, brilliant and transformative. He slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled slightly, and Laura felt the last piece of her broken heart click into place. They were married the following spring by Sheriff Peterson, who had been ordained as a minister before taking up law enforcement. The ceremony was simple, held in the meadow behind their cabin, with Dr. Foster as their only witness. Do you, Joshua Ortiz, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? Sheriff Peterson asked. I do, Joshua replied, his eyes never leaving Laura's face. In sickness and in health, in good times and bad, for as long as we both shall live. And do you, Laura Collins, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? Laura looked at the man who had saved her life in every way that mattered, who had shown her that love could exist without pain. I do, she said, her voice clear and strong. Forever and always. When Sheriff Peterson pronounced them husband and wife, Joshua kissed Laura with all the tenderness and passion that had been building between them for months. The scars were still there, would always be there, but they no longer mattered. They were simply part of her story, proof of what she had survived and overcome. The years that followed were the happiest of Laura's life. She and Joshua built their life together in the mountains, creating a home that was filled with love and laughter, and the quiet contentment that came from being exactly where they belonged. She became known throughout the region as a healer, using medical knowledge to help injured travelers and sick children from the nearby settlements. Her scars, once a source of shame, became a symbol of her expertise with trauma and recovery. People sought her out specifically because they knew she understood what it meant to survive. Their cabin became a refuge for lost souls who needed healing, both physical and emotional. Runaway wives, orphaned children, men broken by war or circumstance all found their way to the mountain couple who understood the value of second chances. One autumn day, nearly 5 years after their wedding, a young woman appeared at their door. She was barely 20, with fresh bruises on her face and terror in her eyes. Laura recognized the look immediately. Please, the girl whispered. I heard you help people like me. Laura opened the door wider, welcoming the stranger into their home. What's your name, dear? Rachel Moore, the girl replied, flinching as if even saying her own name might bring punishment. Laura settled Rachel by the fire and began the familiar ritual of tending wounds and offering comfort. As she cleaned the girl's cuts and applied salve to her bruises, she shared her own story, speaking openly about the abuse she had suffered in the long journey to healing that had followed. You mean it gets better? Rachel asked, her voice filled with desperate hope. Not all at once, Laura replied honestly, and maybe never completely, but yes, it gets better. You learn that you have value beyond what anyone else tells you. Over the following weeks, Rachel slowly began to heal. Like Laura before her, she learned practical skills that would help her survive independently. But more importantly, she began to believe in her own worth. When spring came, Rachel made the decision to travel to California, where she had relatives who might help her start fresh. Laura packed supplies for the journey and gave her a small bag of coins to ease the transition. I'll never forget what you've done for me, Rachel said as she prepared to leave. You saved your own life, Laura corrected gently. You had the courage to leave, to seek help, to believe you deserved better. I just provided a safe place for you to remember who you really are. After Rachel left, Laura found herself thinking about the cycles of healing and hope that seemed to define her life now. She had been saved by Joshua's kindness, and now she was able to pass that gift forward to others who needed it. Do you ever regret it? Joshua asked one evening as they watched the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Leaving civilization behind, living up here with just me for company most of the time? Laura considered the question seriously, thinking about the life she might have had if she had stayed in Pine Ridge or returned to Denver after her name was cleared. Never, she said finally. This life with you in this place, it's exactly what I was meant for. I'm not the same woman who was afraid of her own shadow. I'm someone who can face down killers and win. Someone who can heal others because she's learned to heal herself. You were always that person, Joshua said softly. The scars didn't create your strength, Laura. They just revealed it. Laura reached for his hand, intertwining their fingers as they sat in comfortable silence. The scars were still there, would always be there, but they no longer defined her. They were simply part of her story, proof of what she had survived and overcome. Years continued to pass in their mountain sanctuary, each season bringing its own challenges and rewards. Laura's reputation as a healer grew, and she found herself traveling to distant settlements to tend to difficult cases that local doctors couldn't handle. On a crisp morning in their 10th year together, Laura was tending to a broken leg for a young miner when Dr. Foster from Pine Ridge appeared in their doorway, now considerably older, but still carrying herself with professional dignity. I hope you don't mind the intrusion, Dr. Foster said, but I have a proposition for you both. Laura finished setting the miner's leg and turned her attention to their visitor. What kind of proposition? The territorial government is establishing a new medical college in Denver, Dr. Foster explained. They're looking for experienced practitioners to serve as instructors, people who can teach the next generation of doctors about treating trauma. Laura felt her heart skip a beat. The idea of returning to Denver, of facing the place where her nightmare had begun, filled her with a complex mixture of fear and excitement. They specifically requested you, Laura, DeFoster continued. Your reputation has spread far beyond these mountains. They want someone who understands both the medical and psychological aspects of recovery. I don't have formal medical training, Laura protested. You have something more valuable than formal training, Dr. Foster replied. You have wisdom born of experience, knowledge that can't be learned from textbooks. That night, Laura and Joshua sat by their fire discussing the unexpected opportunity. The offer was flattering, even exciting, but it would mean leaving the life they had built together in the mountains. What do you want to do? Joshua asked. Laura was quiet for a long moment, thinking about all the people who had found their way to their cabin over the years, all the lives that had been changed by the simple act of being seen and valued as human beings. I think, she said slowly, that maybe it's time to take what we've learned here and share it with a wider world. We've helped individuals, but imagine if we could train others to do the same work. Joshua nodded thoughtfully. It would mean going back to Denver, back to where it all started. Yes, Laura said, but I'm not the same woman who fled that city in fear. I'm not afraid of my past anymore, Joshua. It's part of what made me who I am, but it doesn't control who I become. When spring came, they made the journey back to Denver together. Laura felt a strange sense of completion as they rode through the streets where she had once scraped for survival. The city had grown and changed, but more importantly, so had she. The medical college was everything Dr. Foster had promised. Laura found herself energized by the challenge of teaching young doctors not just how to treat injuries, but how to see their patients as whole human beings, deserving of dignity and respect. Medicine is more than just fixing what's broken, she told her first class of students. It's about helping people remember that they have value beyond their injuries, that healing is possible even when the damage seems permanent. One young student raised his hand tentatively. But what about cases where the trauma is too severe, where the patient seems beyond help? Laura smiled, thinking of the woman she had once been, convinced of her own worthlessness and beyond redemption. There is no such thing as beyond help, she said firmly. There are only people who haven't yet found the right kind of healing. Our job as healers is to provide not just medical treatment, but hope. Sometimes hope is the most powerful medicine we can offer. Together, Laura and Joshua split their time between the mountains and the city, bringing the wisdom they had gained through suffering and survival to a new generation of healers and helpers. Laura's scars, which had once marked her as damaged goods, became symbols of resilience and hope for countless students and patients. On their 15th wedding anniversary, they stood together on the porch of their mountain cabin, watching the sun set over the peaks that had sheltered their love and witnessed their transformation. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we had never met?" Laura asked, leaning into Joshua's strong embrace. "Every day," Joshua replied, "and every day I'm grateful that we found each other when we did." Laura touched the scars on her face, feeling not shame but gratitude for the journey that had brought her to this moment. "I used to think these marked me as broken," she said. "Now I know they mark me as someone who survived, someone who learned to fight back, someone who discovered that love is stronger than fear." "They mark you as exactly who you were meant to be," Joshua said softly. "My wife, my partner, my fellow survivor. The woman who taught me that healing is possible, even when the wound seemed too deep to mend." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Laura reflected on the incredible journey that had brought them to this point. She had begun as a victim, convinced of her own worthlessness and resigned to a life of pain. But with Joshua's help, she had discovered that survival was just the first step in a much longer journey toward healing, purpose, and joy. The scars would always be there, a permanent reminder of what she had endured, but they no longer defined her worth or limited her possibilities. They were simply part of her story, proof of her strength and evidence of her capacity to overcome seemingly impossible odds. "I love you," she whispered into the mountain air, the words carrying all the gratitude and wonder she felt at being alive, being loved, being exactly where she belonged. "I love you too," Joshua replied, his voice carrying the same depth of feeling. "Forever and always, just as you are." And in that moment, surrounded by the eternal mountains and held in the arms of the man who had seen past her scars to the woman beneath, Laura knew that she had found something more precious than mere survival. She had found a life worth living, a love worth fighting for, and a purpose that would outlast any wound time could inflict. The mountain wind whispered through the pines, carrying their words up to the stars and back down to the earth that had sheltered their love. Two broken people had found each other in the wilderness and discovered that together they were whole. Their scars had not made them weak. They had made them wise. Their pain had not destroyed them. It had taught them the true value of healing. And in the end, that was the greatest victory of all.